figure out how to upload all those recordings on my computer to YouTube at
Yep.
some point. Okay. All right. Okay, great. Great. All right. So we're going to jump right in. I did think it might be worth, I know we did this the last time too, but I just, first of all, have a couple people that haven't been here previously, and also it's been like 3 weeks since we last met. So I want to really quickly summarize where we've been, and I'm going to add in a little bit. I got some helpful feedback after the last session, and I'm going to add in a little bit in response to that. In session one, we focused a lot on these two really important changes, cultural, political changes in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in Western and Central Europe initially, and then in Eastern Europe. These changes are known as the Enlightenment and the Emancipation. And together, these two changes generated a profound socioeconomic, philosophical, and spiritual transformation in Western and in Europe, European culture writ large. And as a result of those changes in European culture, they generated unprecedented challenges to the understanding of Jewish identity and the practice of Jewish tradition in the modern world that had never existed before. So Jews all of a sudden 230 or 40 years ago were faced with dilemmas that Jews had never been faced with really quite in this way. And those dilemmas, the main dilemmas had to do with whether the authority of Jewish tradition and the rabbis who had been its official interpreters, like what was that authority in this new framework? And for many Jewish people, that authority was significantly diminished. That was uncharted territory for most Jews at that point. European Jews had the option for the first time in history of withdrawing from the Jewish community without having to join another religious group. This was also a unique situation, a unique circumstance for Jews. And so since that time, it's not incorrect to say that every Jew is a Jew by choice, because nobody has to be Jewish anymore. It's something that each person who's involved in the community elects to do. Thirdly, professional and educational opportunities that had been restricted, Jews had not been allowed to do them, now became available, and that interfaced with these other two issues. So, against this backdrop, the entire range of diverse modern Jewish ideologies grew out of varied attempts to create approaches to modern Jewish life that preserve some connection to the Jewish past while allowing for engaged participation in contemporary society. So every non-Orthodox version of Judaism, and even some Orthodox versions of Judaism, are trying in their own way to find that right balance between connection to Jewish tradition and participation in modern society. There were extremes in the Jewish world of groups that really wanted nothing to do with modernity and just wanted to stay connected to Jewish tradition as they understood it, and that those groups are now known as the ultra-Orthodox, although even they have moved in some ways into the modern world in the last half century. On the other end of the spectrum, there was a group called ethical culture that thrived for a while in New York City and on the East Coast. And while that group was not explicitly a Jewish group, almost everybody who joined it was Jewish. And it was basically oriented towards trying to gather up the core ethical commitments of Western religion, which was mostly Jewish religion, and that became the core, and it was discussing how to live out these ethics in modern life, and there was really no specific reference to Jewish tradition among those Jews. Okay, in all of this dynamism, Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionism, and the Reconstructionist movement represent, we think, the only homegrown approach to modern Jewish life in the United States, by which we mean the only approach to Jewish life that really was developed in the U.S. Every other liberal Jewish denomination or stream had roots in Europe and then was imported in one way or another to the United States. Even conservative Judaism, which kind of started in Europe and then, wasn't brought over directly, but then we talked about this crazy situation where there were rabbis invited to this the first ordination, and the menu had all kinds of non-kosher food on it, and there was a whole group of rabbis who said, this is a bridge too far for us. We're gonna stick more to the tradition. And they drew upon the earlier German expression of conservative Judaism, which kind of located itself in between Reform and Orthodoxy. Kaplan's life trajectory and the culture of his family of origin served as the foundation for his radically innovative understandings of how modern Jewish life could thrive in America. He had this unique background, and that really, allowed him to think, the way that he ended up thinking. His definitions of Jewish identity and Jewish tradition, which he used the terms peoplehood for Jewish identity and civilization for Jewish tradition. Those definitions were the most expansive among all the other definitions which had been created up to that point in the modern period. And his definitions included each of the other definitions and also went beyond them. So that was something that is something that a lot of Reconstructionist Jews feel very proud of, that he had these innovative and expansive definitions in response to this historical challenge of living in the post-Enlightenment and post-emancipation world. Okay, so that's the summary from the last two times we met. And if there's nothing burning no burning questions, I just want to put an addendum onto that. So I was encouraged after our last session to make sure to stress when we next met how radical Mordechai Kaplan's thinking was, especially in the context of his generation. And I may not have stated this strongly or clearly enough last time, so I'm going to try to say a few things very clearly about how radical and creative his thinking was. So here are a few examples. He simultaneously emphatically rejected core theological and philosophical assumptions of classical Judaism, even while he affirmed the deeply relevant and essential value of being grounded in Jewish learning, practice, and community. That was no one else had that combination. No one was willing to, question the things that he questioned, and most of, the more liberal Jewish thinkers did not attempt to encourage their followers to continue to practice the traditional rituals or learn the traditional language or all of those things the way that Kaplan did. So he was really kind of a unique combination in that way. So that's one.
Could you repeat that statement?
Yes. That Kaplan simultaneously rejected core beliefs of classical Judaism and embraced and celebrated and encouraged a full participation in Jewish life, in Jewish learning and Jewish practice. So that's a little bit of for some people that was a paradox, but for him it made total sense that both of those things were important to do. Secondly, he had an unwavering confidence in an ongoing and mutually beneficial interplay between Jewish and American culture, or he would say civilization, Jewish civilization and American civilization. He also had a broad, welcoming stance towards social scientific insights. He was really the only Jewish religious leader who felt that way at the time. And many other Jewish and non-Jewish religious leaders were not enthusiastic about social science. They saw it as a threat to the foundation of religious practice. They saw it as, kind of an intellectual distancing, and it would undermine people's commitment. And Kaplan thought the opposite. He was like, no, if we pay attention to the insights and we incorporate them into how we organize ourselves, we'll actually benefit and thrive in the modern world. So he had a very different orientation towards those things. Thirdly, he had a strong sense that the project of reconstructing Jewish tradition would not be constituted by arriving at one specific and lasting set of adaptations, but instead would require continual effort, reflection, and re-examination as new generations of American Jews emerged and as new insights were generated by contemporary scientific, artistic, cultural, and philosophical development. So this was, this is a lifelong commitment. It's like, like being a parent, it's like it's not like it's ever done, it's you keep going. So that was kind of unique because most of the other movements kind of had this vision that they were trying to arrive at. And when they arrived there, they created a platform. And that, even the term platform is, speaks to the sense of solidity that I think some of those other thinkers felt. But Kaplan was never, I'm not aware of there ever being a Reconstructionist platform. But I don't think he would have liked that term.
So, so the insistence on, the encouragement to know classical, to know Hebrew, and to know this is also that you can reconstruct from a place of learning, of education. Right?
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. That's right. Because if you didn't reconstruct from that place, if you weren't grounded in Jewish tradition, then what you reconstruct would be much less compelling and would have much less power, staying power, let's say. Lastly, in this category, his understanding of the crucial importance of maintaining a vibrant and robust version of Jewish community, even as the dynamics of Jewish modernity made that goal more and more difficult. The Jewish community in general, but certainly Jewish community, became more and more difficult as we moved further and further into the modern period. And a good portion of that was driven by the significant numbers of American Jews who moved from the more tight-knit urban centers to the much more physically spread out suburbs after the Second World War and through the 1950s and 60s. So it wasn't just, there was a geographical disconnection that also reinforced a kind of, emotional and spiritual disconnection, that the suburban life did. And so he understood that this sense of belonging, was crucial and was fundamental and was a prerequisite to accessing the richness of all the other dimensions of Jewish civilization, practices, learning, and beliefs. And this is something that I know many of you may have heard before. Belonging comes before behaving and believing. If you don't have a sense of belonging, none of the other stuff is gonna speak over the long period of time, over the long haul. And much of his teaching, especially after he published his magnum opus, Judaism as a Civilization, was very consciously addressed to the Jews who had moved out to the suburbs after the Second World War. That was a huge percentage of the American Jewish population, that 20-year period after World War II. Okay, so his thinking was radical. It was, no one else in the American Jewish, universe was thinking the way he was thinking. And people loved him or hated him, but everybody felt like they had to read him. Everybody had to be in dialogue with him because he was seen as, the preeminent voice that was really trying to articulate this new version of modern American Judaism. Okay, so far so good? Okay. All right. So this next part, I think we touched on these things a little bit last time, but we're going to start talking about kind of the role and the authority of Jewish tradition. And then we're going to talk a little bit about God in Reconstructionism, and hopefully we'll have time to talk a little bit about Israel and Zionism as well. That's I know it's ambitious, but we'll see how we get. Okay, before we jump into the authority of the Jewish past, I just want to kind of make this overarching statement that in Kaplan's thinking, religion at its best involves cultivating a conscious dialogue and ideally an integration between various different binaries in our lives. So the inherited tradition and our own life experience. We want those things to be in conversation with each other, and ideally we want to integrate them. And another way of saying that is the past and the present. The lens of particularism, of Jewish particularism, and the lens of universalism. We want those arenas to be in dialogue with each other. And along with that goes the ideas of homeland and diaspora. We want those ideas to be in dialogue with each other. And if we get to the section on Zionism, he had a unique understanding of the relationship between initially the homeland of Israel and then later the state of Israel with the diaspora. He had a very unique take on that. All right. So we're going to jump into the value and authority of Jewish tradition. So this is encapsulated, and I think we did talk about this a little bit, in the very pithy phrase, the past gets a vote, but not a veto. Again, he was really into democracy. He loved the American political system, and he used that language to describe his sense of how we should relate to Jewish tradition. So the past gets a vote. Now, it often gets pointed out in Reconstructionist circles that when people see this, people think, oh, the past only gets a vote, not a veto, therefore I'm going to just, whatever, I'm going to do. This is not to say, obviously, everyone can do whatever they want, but the value of the vote is what Lila said before, that it's not just about the past deserving a vote. We benefit from giving the past a vote. We get something out of the process of engaging Jewish tradition and grounding ourselves, regardless of where our thinking and practice goes, in whatever direction. We're going to be in a more enriched and grounded place in our Jewish lives if we have explored what Jewish tradition has to say about whatever the particular issue or situation is that we're trying to decide about. So tradition is an incredibly valuable record of how our ancestors discovered and constructed meaning and morality and spirituality in their lives. And we can certainly sometimes incorporate some of the ways that they did that into our 21st century lives. And even if we can't incorporate the results of that process, if we can mimic the process, that's also valuable for us, even if we land in a very different place. So that's the vote of the past. The veto, though, is that if our contemporary sensibilities really push back against some value or teaching that comes out of Jewish tradition, we do have the right and probably the obligation to say, either we're going to reconstruct that tradition so that it's more in alignment with our contemporary values, or in the very rare case that we can't reconstruct, we will actually have to let something go. And I think I might have said the last time, the only thing that he said out of the entirety of Jewish tradition that he could not even reconstruct, he could reconstruct God, he could reconstruct, the idea of commandment. He could not reconstruct the idea of chosenness, of the chosen people. That was the one thing that he could not find any way to reconstruct. And so that was the only thing he said, I cannot see how we can bring that in any way, shape, or form into modern Reconstructionist thinking. So that's kind of interesting that was the one piece that he felt that way about. In addition to grounding us, the extent to which we can, that we're in dialogue with Jewish tradition and that we can, find inspiration there, that also connects us to other Jews across time and space, which is a really meaningful thing. I was talking with someone within the last month or so about our prayer book, our Shabbat prayer book. And it's happened so many times that when people take this Recon 101 mini course, and maybe they haven't been to a Shabbat service, and they show up at our Shabbat service and they open up our prayer book and they see all this very traditional sounding God language. And they'll come to me and they'll say, gee, how do you square the language of the prayer book with everything that we talked about in terms of, the different ways of thinking about God? And that's an excellent point, and it's an excellent question. And part of the answer to the question is that the people in the movement who were in charge of creating this prayer book were also trying to create a balance between innovation, but also staying connected to Jews across time and space. And that is the, and they made a judgment call 30 years ago or 35 years ago that, keeping a decent amount of the traditional God language, they trusted that people would be able to translate in whatever was meaningful for them. I think that might have been a tall order for some people, but that is where they came down. And I do think that if we ever get space to breathe as a movement in the next, decade or so, I think there will be a new prayer book project. I think it's time for us to have a new prayer book. Now, I just want to note, though, that our prayer book series, Kol HaLev, became the model for the other liberal American Jewish denominations. So now the Reform movement and the Conservative movement both have prayer books that are structured in some way like Kol HaLev is, for, in terms of incorporating commentary. And that was one of the ways, by the way, they balanced out the traditional language. They brought in commentary that questioned or challenged some of the traditional language, or they brought in poetry that was much more accessible. And you can find all these poems that are embedded either in the service itself, or anyone who's been to a service knows in the back of the prayer book there's like 50 pages of poetry that when people are leading services they can draw from those poems and those readings. So anyway, that Reconstruction, because it's a civilization model, wants to stay connected to other Jews. That's also really important. And it's a value to affirm, if there are really core ethical and moral commitments we have as modern Jews that are not in alignment with, like the central message on a particular issue from Jewish tradition. All right. This orientation of the past getting a vote but not a veto puts us in general terms somewhere in between the official stance of conservative Judaism in the United States and the official stance of Reform Judaism in the United States. And I say official very intentionally because there are plenty of Jews who belong to synagogues that are affiliated with either of those movements who do not live their lives according to the principles of either movement, as is true of Reconstructionism, But officially, conservative Judaism is based on Jewish law in the same way that Orthodox Judaism is. That is the official stance of conservative Judaism. The one main difference between conservative Judaism and Orthodoxy when it comes to Jewish law is that instead of individual rabbis interpreting Jewish law, the movement of conservative Judaism has a group of very learned rabbis who together deliberate on a question, and then they come up with usually more than one answer. Usually it's multiple answers, and then individual rabbis theoretically have the right and responsibility to choose from among the answers that the group of leading rabbis have come up with. But all of those answers are supposed to be grounded in Jewish legal precedent and Jewish legal thought. That's the conservative movement officially. The Reform movement officially, and please, I always feel a little funny speaking for other movements, but I did grow up in the Reform movement, for whatever that's worth, and I know it's a different movement now than it was when I was growing up too. But my understanding of the Reform movement when I was growing up, and also that I had when I was, in rabbinical school, is that officially, for the Reform movement, each Jewish decision, it's really up to each individual Jew to figure that out. Now, that doesn't mean that individual Jews shouldn't study. Of course they should study. But it's kind of an independent responsibility for each member of the Jewish community, as far as I understand it. So the Reconstructionist movement lands a little bit in the middle of those two. We recognize everyone is going to make their own decisions, but there's this value placed on the communal dimension of thinking about ethical issues and of sourcing Jewish traditions and perspectives, and again, kind of working on that dialogue process. So that, I think, puts us in a slightly different place officially than the Reform movement is. Unofficially, that's a whole different story. Okay. I will just mention here that there's a process that's pretty well known in Reconstructionist Judaism called values-based decision-making that was created by Rabbi David Teutsch, who was the president of the movement for many years, the president of the Rabbinical College. And it's a very highly structured way of engaging the tradition and engaging our modern values and trying to create a hierarchy of values when we're trying to figure out a particular ethical or moral challenge. I will share here that my experience with that structure is that it's really, really difficult to do it well. But it was a very valiant attempt to say, okay, here's how we do this, because it's not an easy thing to do, right? To actually say that our community is going to go through this process that's going to assess what are the core traditional values on this question, what are the core contemporary values on this question. We're going to try to give different weights to different values, and then come out with a recommendation that is somehow a synthesis of all of that. Much easier said than done. Okay. All right. So that's what I want to say about Jewish tradition before we jump into God. Let me just ask if there's a couple of questions about anything so far. We can look at that, or we can keep moving, and people can, maybe you'll have questions if we get to we'll see. We're doing okay right now, actually. I'm feeling good about how we've moved so far. So, but no questions right now. Okay. All right. Okay. Let's talk about God. All right. And again, if you had questions also, if you had a chance to read any of these chapters, we can absolutely, I want to talk about this too. I'm trying to kind of like squeeze the essence of each of these chapters into, just a short sharing. Okay, so I think the most important, one of the most important ideas in that chapter is on the first page of the God chapter, and it points out that in Reconstructionist Judaism, the idea of God is never referred to as a through line of Jewish civilization. There is no single Jewish idea of God. It does not exist. There are many, many, many different Jewish ideas of God that existed in different eras, that it existed among different subsets of the Jewish people, and which I think is a great thing. There's a lot of, for people who are interested in finding a connection, an image, and understanding that works in the modern world, there are so many different options to choose from, including the idea that's in the Shema that God is one. That phrase can be understood in 50 different ways. God is one does not mean one thing, even though some people will say that it does. Some people will say, oh, that means that we only worship one God. And other people will say, no. It means that God is either the entity or the reality that creates oneness out of the diversity of creation. Two very different views of God, and there's lots of other views of God too. So of the oneness, what God is one means. For Kaplan, and we talked about this a little bit, God is a force or a process rather than a being. This is for Kaplan. This is not a Reconstructionist dogma. We have very little that's a Reconstructionist dogma, if anything, I'll say. But Kaplan thought of God as a force or a being, and Kaplan believed that this force is responsible for the bias in the universe towards order, peace, and justice. Sounds a little bit like Dr. Martin Luther King, right? The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Well, Kaplan absolutely believed that. Kaplan also used the phrase life abundant to describe this bias that's built into the universe that is represented by the divine process. Kaplan also used the perhaps unfortunate term of salvation to describe this same process. And, a lot of Jews in the modern world especially identify the word salvation as a term that comes out of Christianity. It absolutely exists in Judaism. In Hebrew, the word is Yeshua. It's all over the prayer book. Yeshua. By the way, Jesus' Hebrew name is Yeshu. It's a derivative of that term, which is not shocking. And that is translated as salvation. But in English, it has this weird valence. But that's the language that Kaplan used, for better or for worse. He called his theology transnaturalism. Now, if you read the chapter, it's a very slippery idea, transnaturalism. But one phrase that helped me understand it is that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. There is no separate being that is transcendent, that transcends the universe, but there is a divine process that is embedded, that is integrated, that is, looking for the right verb, built into the universe, and that divine process is very real, according to Kaplan. Now, many of his contemporaries accused him of being a closet atheist based on this theology. They said, you don't really believe in God at all. You're just like, you're parading this idea of transnaturalism, but you've gotten rid of God. And Kaplan nothing offended him more than someone accusing him of being an atheist, because he absolutely said, no, this is my faith. I have to have faith to believe that the universe is constructed in such a way that justice and peace and order, that there's a bias towards those things in the universe, and that if we work towards those goals in human society, we will be supported by this divine energy in the universe. So, but that didn't keep people from making that accusation. Transnaturalism. Let me say that Kaplan's particular reconstruction of Jewish theology, of traditional Jewish theology, does not speak to all members of our movement. Some people it speaks to very strongly and powerfully, and some people it doesn't. And that's okay, because, again, going back to what Lila said earlier, the point of this whole effort is you have to keep going through the process, the cycle of engaging and reflecting and examining. And so we are never done asking questions about what we believe. We're never done with that. And so the most important thing is that in your thinking about what you believe around this issue or any other issue in Jewish life, that you bring your best, most insightful, most informed brain cells to this conversation, and that whatever you come up with, that it is based on, you don't feel like you're having to bracket any part of your other thinking in the process. That's the key, that's the core of how to approach constructing or evolving a Jewish view of divinity, or of other Jewish commitments in life. I think I said this last time. I'll repeat it because I love the phrase. We should not have to check our brains at the door of the synagogue. That was a big. I don't know if Kaplan ever said that, but that really captures a core piece of what he felt about all of this. I'll say one thing about transnaturalism, though. It broke, in some ways, it really broke the theological mode that was present in much of Jewish life up until his time. And that's with the understanding that there were lots of different versions of how people believed in God, but his transnaturalism was so different, it just broke things wide open. And so my sense is that in the Reconstructionist movement, there is this real openness to people's thinking and experience of the divine. And I credit Kaplan with creating that openness, because he was courageous enough and had enough integrity to articulate his theological orientation, which was really, really different from a lot of his contemporaries. So I think that's one really wonderful ramification of the work that he did theologically. In that vein, if you haven't discovered this yet, so the national movement is called Reconstructing Judaism. It's it's an unusual name for a movement. The movement went through a branding process, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8, 10 years ago with a consultant, and they chose this name. And it's a combination of the rabbinical school and the congregational arm of the movement. It's housed in the same building in suburban Philadelphia. Reconstructing Judaism, we have a really great website, the national movement does. Lots of information, but there's a particular part of the website that I would absolutely encourage you to look at, and it's called Evolve, which I love that name. One of my favorite teachers in rabbinical school and a mentor of mine, Rabbi Jacob Staub, is in charge of running this part of the website, and he's constantly looking for Jewish voices in the movement to write about a variety of things. There are theological writings out there, there are political writings out there, philosophical. There are just a lot of, socio-political. There's a lot of different stuff, and from lots of different angles within the movement. So really encourage you to take a look at Evolve on the Reconstructing Judaism website. So Kaplan's belief in God, again, I think we touched on this the last time, had serious implications for other core beliefs in Judaism, like the idea of divine revelation or the idea of chosenness that we have talked about already this evening. For Kaplan, it didn't make sense to talk about chosenness if he didn't believe in the divine being an entity, because a force is not going to choose between one group or another. Individuals and groups are equally capable of discovering the divine force of the universe, and people who try harder might, discover that force more quickly or have a stronger connection to it, but there is no choice on the part of the force. So chosen is the other, and he also believed that ethically chosenness was really problematic in the modern world, that we really needed to be building towards a world where there was really a lot of mutual respect and support and understanding. And he felt that chosenness just carried an inherent bias. Now, there's a small minority of people in the Reconstructionist movement who believe that there's a way to rehabilitate chosenness. If you look at it on a mythic level and kind of through a Jungian lens, maybe there's a way that we can see that it plays a role kind of psychospiritually, but we're not saying that it's actually ontologically real. For me, that has never been compelling. I've been a strong Kaplanian on this issue from the get-go, and it's one of the reasons that I was drawn to the Reconstructionist movement, because of the really strong rejection of Jews as a chosen people. And so it's not a ideological litmus test, but it is the center of gravity, I think, of our movement. So I know that we have people in our community, in our local community in Kol HaLev, who have a different relationship with chosenness, which is totally fine. But whenever we talk about chosenness, it's really important for me that we include Kaplan's thinking about it so that his voice is present in the conversation. Divine revelation, same thing. A force will not initiate a revelatory action, but rather human beings, individually and collectively, will discover or encounter the sacred in their lives and experience. We might experience what feels like a revelation from our perspective, which it is. We are discovering something different and deep about life. That is a revelation to us, but Kaplan would say it is not being initiated by divinity, that the divine is always there, always available for anyone who seeks to discover it. So the Torah, and he would have said, not just the Torah, every document of any religion that claims to be an artifact of divine revelation in the strict sense of the term, he would have said, I can't affirm that, I can't embrace it. What I believe is that it's a document that reflects a human experience of the sacred or the holy, and the human attempt to convey that experience to future generations. And for him and for many Reconstructionists, that does not take away from the importance in any way of the text. It's still an incredibly important thing to have a document that points us in the direction of the experience of the sacred. But again, the center of gravity, this is not everybody again, but the center of gravity in the Reconstructionist movement is that the Torah is a human document that emerges from human experience of the sacred. Okay. How are we doing? Good? Okay. All right. Thank you for sticking with us. And again, just please, I think we're into the real, the meat of the conversation this evening. So I do want to say a little bit about, so how do you think about ritual in this context? If you don't believe that the commandments were revealed by a divine being, and I'm not presuming everybody feels that way here, but let's presume for the purpose of this conversation from a Capelanian perspective, how would he have justified continuing to practice Jewish rituals if he didn't believe God was commanding him to do that? And I think he had a really good answer to that question, which is that any Jewish ritual that emerged from this same kind of attempt and sensitivity to connect with the sacred, and that's been practiced by generations and generations of Jewish people throughout history, that there's some power to that. Not power that comes because God said we should do it, but it's imbued with the energy of generations and generations of Jewish human beings. And which doesn't mean we have to do it. It just means that if we can find a way to connect with it, there's some power there for us. There's some inspiration there for us. This is just a little tangent, but I once read a book by kind of this guy who's he's an outlier British botanist. And he has this whole theory, and I'm not going to try to explain it. It's been a little while since I looked at it, but part of his theory is that when it comes to language and when it comes to action, if words have been spoken by tons and tons of people, and if actions have been taken by tons and tons of people, this radical botanist believes that those actions and those words create a kind of groove in the universe that make it a little bit easier for new people to enter into those words and those actions. And so I know I don't think there's any proof for this, but I found that idea very beautiful and also very as a really powerful expression of kind of a Capelanian appreciation for the power of ritual. That simply the fact that a ritual has existed over a long period of time generates a certain kind of spiritual opportunity that's much harder to come by with a ritual that got created a year ago. You don't have to believe that, but that's one of the answers that Kaplan gave, and it's one of the answers that other Reconstructionist thinkers have given, that there's power to the ritual because Jewish people have done this ritual in the past and they do it in the present, and doesn't mean we have to do any particular ritual again, but there is an opportunity to the extent to which we can find a way to create a personal connection to that ritual and bring it into our lives and integrate it into our lives. By the way, the word mitzvah, which in Hebrew means commandment, the same root in Aramaic, Hebrew's cousin language, means connection. That's what it means in Aramaic. So some people translate the prayer that we say over doing a mitzvah, like Asher Kiddeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, as we embrace this opportunity to connect with the divine. It's not about a commanded thing, it's about an opportunity to connect. So I share that if that's meaningful for anybody. But on the ritual end, that's why Jewish ritual continues to be meaningful, and it brings us together in community, which we remember was the kind of the primary goal from Kaplan's perspective, is being in community with each other, and ritual is one good way of having that happen. So, and then when it comes to the ethical dimension of Judaism, I think that's even an easier response, because we are so lucky that we have, a millennium and a half of collected written debates between Jewish, smart, insightful Jewish people about all kinds of different human ethical dilemmas. And granted, the vast, vast majority of them were male, which is a huge problem. And that has been, the Jewish people has been working on addressing that now for a couple of generations, and there's real progress being made. And the mostly men who generated those texts, that there is value in those texts. And most civilizations don't have written records of ethical debates that go back 1,500 years. I mean, it's amazing, the volume of Jewish books that exist. If we could somehow put all the Jewish books that have ever been written in one library, I can't imagine how big that thing would have to be. I can't imagine. I would love to see someone speculate about, how much space you would need. The vast majority still of those books have never been translated, either from Hebrew or from Arabic. More and more are being translated today, which is great. The website Safaria, if you haven't discovered it, is a real amazing resource. Not all of they've collected tons and tons of traditional Jewish texts, and they're working on translating texts that have not yet been translated, and it's a great thing. So when it comes to ethical dilemmas, individually or communally, we have this treasure trove of thinking that has come before us that we can draw on. Again, it doesn't mean we have to follow the conclusions that other people came to, but it's there as a resource and an opportunity and a gift. And, why not take advantage of that? Okay. I'll just say I'm not going to talk a lot about prayer right now. Prayer is kind of a special subset of the ritual challenge. If you happen to have a Kaplanian view of the universe, there's a really nice list in the Exploring Judaism book of ways of framing for ourselves the purposes of prayer if you don't think you're asking a transcendent divine being to answer your prayer. There are lots of different ways. And again, doesn't mean you can't approach prayer that way, but just for the purposes of this conversation, there are people who are deeply Kaplanian in their theologies who love coming to services on Shabbat. Leah Kamiankowski, Zichrona Livracha, may her memory be for a blessing. She did not subscribe to any traditional notion of God at all, and she would come to services very frequently on Shabbat, and there are other people who do that in our community and in other Reconstructionist communities. So there are many examples of people for whom prayer has become an important Jewish touchstone, ritual touchstone for them, even though they're approaching it in a very, very different way than many, many generations of Jews have approached prayer. So I'll just say that. And there are some good articles on prayer on the Evolve website of, prayer in the Reconstructionist context. Okay, it's only 8:13, and we're up to Israel and Zionism. Okay, maybe we can do this. Okay, here we go. I think we mentioned in the first session, and maybe a little bit in the second, that Zionism was one response among many to the challenges posed by the modern period that we described at the beginning of our conversation tonight. In Europe, especially Western Europe, almost all the responses to the challenges of modernity were to create a modern Jewish religion, to make Judaism into a religion first and foremost and primarily. And so you were a German of the Mosaic persuasion, or you were a French person of the Mosaic persuasion, or an American of the Mosaic persuasion. That's what Judaism meant to a lot of those 19th and 20th century Jews. Zionism was a completely different answer to the same set of problems. And the answer was, we're part of a nation. Judaism is a nation. Jews are a nation. Religion is part of our national identity, but the main thing about our identity is our national identity. And what we want to do with that is we want to go back to our biblical homeland, and we want to recreate a Jewish authority there. There were different so let's talk about some of the different versions. There were many different versions of Zionism, which has gotten lost in the last half century, but it's important for us to be aware. So one of the earliest schools of Zionism is called spiritual or cultural Zionism, and the thinker Achad Ha'am is identified with this school of Zionism. And he believed that if Jews returned to the biblical homeland, which was then known as Palestine, it would renew dormant Jewish collective energy and creativity, that contact with the land, and this is such a 19th century idea, right? That the land itself with the people it would generate all this new energy. So he believed that it was valuable for Jews to reestablish a connection with that piece of geography because it would enhance our spiritual lives. And along with that, he envisioned a revival of the Hebrew language, which was not really a spoken language for a really long time, for like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And also music, theater, literature, poetry, dance, philosophy, spirituality. Who does that sound like to you? Very Kaplanian, right? Kaplan really loved Achad Ha'am. And for Achad Ha'am and for the spiritual cultural Zionists, the idea of a Jewish state was secondary to the idea of renewing Jewish culture in the homeland, the biblical homeland of the Jewish people. So that's one school. Then we have another school that's called practical Zionism. Practical Zionism was really focused on settling and building institutions in Palestine. And there are different subsets of this practical Zionism. One subset, known as political Zionism, and Theodor Herzl is identified with this sub-school, that the main reason we're going to do this, that we're going to build up the settlement in the Jewish biblical homeland, and for Herzl, that absolutely meant the ultimate creation of a state, of a Jewish state, in what was then the land of Palestine. because Jews were never going to be safe anywhere in the world. That was his main MO in championing this. And he came to this whole thing out of an experience and an understanding of how alive and well anti-Semitism was in Europe. And it shocked him. And he said, you know what? The only way Jews are going to be safe is we got to build our own state in the land of Palestine. So that was political Zionism. Another subset of this school was labor Zionism or socialist Zionism. And these Zionists wanted to build up the land like the political Zionists, but they really wanted to, Herzl and the political Zionists wanted Israel to be a state like all other states. They wanted to normalize the Jewish experience in a global political and civilizational context. The labor Zionists did not want to do that. They still held out this idea of this traditional notion of Jews as being a light unto the nations. And they wanted this new state of Israel to embrace the best of what socialism had brought into the modern understanding, and that this new Jewish state was going to be one where people were cooperative rather than competing all the time. The whole notion of a kibbutz comes out of this school. Herzl didn't care about kibbutzim, but the labor Zionists, this was the central part of, they wanted to build up, because the kibbutz was the ideal model of the kind of society they wanted to create on a countrywide basis. They also believed in the value of Jewish labor. This was a rejection of this diaspora notion of Jews being very involved in learning and with financial matters, and they wanted Jewish farmers. That was a really big part of their ideology. And the kibbutz and the moshav were institutions that actually brought this into being, amazingly. Later on, these same leaders of the labor Zionist movement created much larger institutions in Israel, like this huge labor union called the Histadrut in Israel, which has a percentage of membership that far exceeds anything in the United States. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but at its peak, it has been diminishing like it has been in the United States. But at its peak, a huge percentage of Israelis belong to the Histadrut. They also created a national health service that was based on these same values of labor Zionism. So all of that came out of the labor Zionist ideology. Then we have the religious or Orthodox Zionists, and Rav Kook, Avraham HaKohen Kook, is seen as the godfather of this movement. And this was an idea that most Orthodox Jews were not supportive of the Zionist movement initially, because they felt that it was very clear in their understanding of Jewish tradition that Jews could only en masse go back to the biblical homeland with the Messiah, with the advent of the Messiah. So a lot of Orthodox Jews were strongly opposed to any kind of major resettlement in the land of Israel. Rav Kook represented an outlier group of religious Zionists who said, no, I think this historic opportunity is part of the religious movement. It's part of what God is making happen right now. And I think religious Jews should go to Israel. And not only that, but I think religious Jews should make friends with the labor Zionists and the political Zionists, who, by the way, were often radically secular. They did not observe Jewish traditions in any recognizable way from an Orthodox perspective. But Rav Kook was this interesting figure because he was a deeply Orthodox person. He was a mystic. He was a Kabbalist. But he was committed to being in dialogue with these secular Jews, these young secular Jews. He was like an older person when he came to live there. And he was the first chief rabbi of Palestine, who then became the first chief rabbi of the early state of Israel. And he was in conversation with a lot of these young ideological labor Zionists. And his fellow Orthodox rabbis challenged him about that. Like, how can you be talking to these people who don't observe Shabbat, and they eat pork on Yom Kippur? Like, you shouldn't be talking to them and giving them legitimacy. And he really pushed back against that. So he saw this as part of the fulfillment of biblical prophecy as an Orthodox rabbi. And the religious Zionists, that movement has now become a much bigger part of Israeli society. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this, because that has, from my perspective, it has really complicated the whole situation for Israeli Jews and Palestinians, but we'll get there. There was also a school of Zionism called Revisionist Zionism. It was led by a man named Zev Jabotinsky, and all the other schools of Zionism were, for the most part, interested in leveraging whatever connections and relationships individual Jews had with people who were in power in different parts of the world, mostly in Europe, because at the time, that whole part of the world was a protector. It was a part of, after World War I, it was divided up among all the European powers. So between, Britain and France, Spain, I don't know, Spain and Germany, I don't know. Anyway, but Britain and France for sure had large chunks of the Middle East that they were in control over. And Zev Jabotinsky, he was not so excited about working with these leaders in other societies. He wanted the Jews to do it on their own, do everything, to make things happen. And he did not want to compromise with either, these leaders from, these foreign countries. Later on, when there was a negotiation around, eventually with the United Nations, and there was I want to say legislation. That's not what I mean, but the movement to create a state, and that proposal contained a proposal for a Jewish state and a Palestinian state on the, what is now Israel proper and the West Bank and Gaza. And he did not like setting aside a part of the land for a Palestinian state. He was opposed to that. And he wanted to maximize. He was a maximalist. He was a Jewish maximalist. And he was also willing to go to greater lengths in terms of being aggressive with weapons. And he was willing to attack British troops, and he was willing to attack Palestinians. And so he has a kind of a, in Israeli history, he's seen as this person who is more on the extreme right. But today's Likud party, which has been the dominant party in Israel for the last 40 years is the spiritual descendant of the revisionist Zionists. So that's an important thing to know in terms of where they're coming from ideologically. Kevin.
So where did Kaplan stand with all these different forms of Zionism?
I'm so glad you asked that question, Kevin. Thank you. Thank you. So Kaplan, first of all, Kaplan did affirm in general Zionist ideology. It fit into his civilizational model, right? Jews could live in Israel, Jews could live in the diaspora, and both of those choices were legitimate according to him. He leaned more towards the spiritual, cultural Zionism of Achad Ha'am, but he didn't oppose. There was a minority, a small group of Zionists who really wanted to create a binational state in the 1920s and 30s. I don't believe that Kaplan was a part of that group, although he may have had sympathies with that group. But he really saw the state was going to be a vehicle for cultural and spiritual renewal. It was not an end in itself. That was certainly something that he believed. It was not an end in itself. And I don't think he probably felt that the safety of Jews was the number one objective of the creation of the state. But, he was a fluent Hebrew speaker. He spent a fair amount of time in Israel, and he actually made Aliyah when he was in his early 80s, and he lived in Jerusalem for 20 years. And he came back to the States. I feel like he's buried in the U.S., actually, which is so interesting, right? I mean, he could have been buried in Jerusalem, but I think he made the choice to be buried in New York. I'm not 100% certain of that, and that's knowable. We can Google it. But he did live in Israel for 20 years at the very end of his life, and that was something that was very meaningful to him. Let's see. He acknowledged the value of being Jewish in a society where Jews were the majority. He said that's a different experience than being Jewish in a society where Jews are a minority. It's a whole different experience. And it's unique because Jews can be a minority in every other country of the world, and only in Israel could Jews be a majority. So he saw there was value in that. He saw, and he was not a rejectionist of the diaspora. A lot of Zionists said the diaspora is useless, and basically all you Jews who are living in the diaspora, someday you're going to come live in Israel whether you like it or not, because you're gonna face some kind of anti-Semitic uprising that's going to force you to move to Israel, and then we're going to be able to say, sorry, but we told you so. So that was the classical Zionist attitude towards, and they would say, everything that got built in the diaspora, including, by the way, the two Talmuds, and one Talmud was written in Jerusalem, but the main Talmud is the Babylonian Talmud that was written in the diaspora, and that's the Talmud that is turned to most frequently by learned Jews around the world. But for many of the Zionists, that was none of that stuff had a lot of value. It was all about coming back to Israel, reestablishing your connection with the land. If you're going to study a text, let it be the Hebrew Bible, because that was a text that was created in the land of Israel. But all the other diaspora creations that happened, a lot of classical Zionists just did not think it held much value. They held much value. But Kaplan didn't feel that way. Oh, Thank you. He is buried in New York. That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Julia. That's awesome to know. So, because he loved America too, he believed very deeply that as unique as the experience of Israeli Jews was, he believed that Israeli Jews could learn something from American Jews. He also believed that American Jews could learn things from Israeli Jews. But he thought Israeli Jews could learn something from American Jews too, and that was a very outlier, position to take in the 1950s and 60s. And but he absolutely believed that. He thought Israel could learn about democracy from the American Jewish community and from the American, from American history more generally. As kind of ironically poignant as that is in this particular moment, but let's not go down that road. So that was unusual that he saw, he was into dialogue and integration, and he said the Israeli Jews and the American Jews should be in dialogue with each other, and should learn from each other and should not try to dominate in either direction. Okay. Want to talk about a little bit about contemporary Israel, but then I want to talk about kind of the contemporary Reconstructionist movement and Israel and Zionism. So, as I mentioned, this kind of religious Zionism that has kind of grown into a inflamed messianism among many traditionally Orthodox Jews since this all has happened since the Six-Day War in 1967. Because what happened in that war, a couple things were really impactful. One was that in the experience of Israel and the experience of the global Jewish community, Israel had a miraculous victory in that war because there were all these other, and there's been a lot of historical exploration of this, and it's the actualities may have differed, but the subjective experience was absolutely that the Jewish state was, near to being annihilated, and there was this miraculous victory that happened, and not only was there a victory, but the city of Jerusalem entirely was retaken, where it had been a divided city between Jordan and Israel, and Jews did not have access to the Western Wall, for example, the Kotel, prior to 67. And that became this, that was always an important religious site. And so there was this sense of miraculousness. And in the Orthodox world, there was this real sense that it was divine intervention, that caused this, that brought this about. And that has continued to strengthen among that group, that subset of the Jewish people over the last half century. And that led to the desire to settle in the territories that were captured, because beyond Jerusalem, the West Bank was captured from Jordan as well. And there has been this internal debate within Israel since then around, using the captured territories as a negotiating tool to reach a peaceful agreement. And more over the last decades, another Israeli voice that has come to say these lands are actually biblically and religiously more important to us than the state of Israel that was created in 1948. And we shouldn't give them back. We should keep them. And ultimately, we should make them part of the state of Israel. And God wants us to do that. Not everybody who lives there believes that, but the people who are the leaders of many of the people who live in the West Bank do believe that they are doing God's will. by building new settlements there. And there's been this whole drama that's unfolded, right? Because in the early 90s, this Oslo peace process, which was also kind of miraculous when it started, it felt like it was kind of miraculous. And, Yitzhak Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin, who was the prime minister, agreed to go into negotiations with Yasser Arafat, and came to a initial partial agreement that was going to set up further negotiations that would ultimately lead to the creation of a Palestinian state. So all kinds of things happened that really made that vision a difficult one to fulfill. And some of those things happened on the Palestinian side, and some of those things happened on the Israeli Jewish side. The biggest thing that happened on the Israeli Jewish side was that an Orthodox Jewish man who felt that the prime minister of Israel was going against the will of God decided that it was his job to take the life of Yitzhak Rabin because he was a danger to the Jewish people. And so he took it into his own hands and he assassinated Yitzhak Rabin. And after Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, there was no other Jewish leader that had the cachet that Rabin had to continue to really work towards this vision of a Palestinian state. Rabin was a former general, and not just any former general. He had been a leader in many of the past wars that Israel had fought. So no one could really authentically say to him that he was not taking Jewish safety into account, which is one of the accusations that have been made over the years. But nobody really was able to step in to his shoes after he was killed, after he was murdered. And by the way, again, this is history that not everybody knows, but Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been the prime minister of Israel for most of the last 20 years, was one of the people on the right in Israel who was accusing Rabin of being a traitor to the Jewish people. So he has been, some people would say that he was part of the incitement that encouraged, even though he never had a conversation with this Orthodox settler who went to the rally and murdered Rabin, he created an environment of incitement that made it more likely and more acceptable for someone who believed what this Yigal Amir was the name of the assassin, what Yigal Amir believed to take that step. And so ever since then, there's been this drama around, is there going to be a Palestinian state or not? And the American government up until recently has been a strong supporter of the movement towards a Palestinian state, and Israeli governments have really varied. Netanyahu's governments have really never been that excited about the idea of a Palestinian state. And that has led to, but the situation that now exists, which is a very difficult situation, is that there are, millions of Palestinians who live in the West Bank, and the Israeli army they are like in charge of handling the Palestinians in the West Bank, and that the Palestinians in the West Bank don't really have rights. They are subject to the Israeli military rule. And so that's a problem. And, some people think that problem can be lived with indefinitely. Some people think that one solution to the problem is, a significant percentage of the Palestinians have to be kicked out of the West Bank, so that when the West Bank is annexed by an Israeli government, there won't be a majority of Palestinians between the river and the sea. And other people think that the only way to create a sustainable future for the state of Israel is to move forward with the creation of a Palestinian state. And some people have gone back to this original notion in the 1920s and 30s of creating a binational state. There are Jewish people who think that, and non-Jewish people think that. So but given the political realities both in Israel and in the United States at this point, it's hard to imagine that that anything super productive is gonna come out of this, from my perspective. Kevin.
So has the Reconstructionist movement taken a particular stand? Let's get back to Reconstruction.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, fair enough. And then we'll wrap this up. So thank you, Kevin. You are good keeping me on track. So okay, let me talk about the Reconstructionist movement. The Reconstructionist movement has a political center of gravity that is moderate to progressive, liberal, I would say, on most domestic issues. On the issue of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there is much more diversity in the Reconstructionist movement, which is really problematic and complicated. And when I say diversity, I mean we have almost the entire spectrum of political orientations around Israel. And maybe I don't think there are any people in the Reconstructionist movement, and I could be proven wrong, who would support like a Kahanist, Smotrich, I don't think there are anybody like that. But there are people who support the idea of building settlements, ongoing settlements. And there might be people who support the idea of annexing the West Bank. And then that's not the center of gravity of our movement. The center of gravity of the other extreme are people who, are do not think the state of Israel should exist in any form, and who would say that the creation of the state of Israel in 1948 was a historic mistake and an historic injustice to the Palestinians. So we have both of those perspectives among membership in our movement, and everything in between. I would say that the center of gravity within the Reconstructionist movement, and I say center of gravity very intentionally because, again, there's a wide spectrum, that the center of gravity is somewhere around a J Street kind of position, which puts us center of gravity-wise to the left of all the other movements in this country. And the idea being, the main idea of J Street is that the U.S. government, it's a very pro-two-state, it's a pro-Israel and pro-peace platform, a pro-two-state platform, and a pro-American pressure platform. So J Street is a Jewish organization, an advocacy organization that believes it's important for the American government to use its power and leverage to move the Israelis and the Palestinians towards a two-state solution. And that's been its MO since its founding. No other Jewish advocacy organization thinks that diaspora Jews have the right to say anything about what goes on in Israel, with the partial exception that in the mid-90s, when the Oslo Accords were happening, and the Israeli prime minister and his government were having negotiations with Palestinians and with people who are identified as terrorists, like Yasser Arafat, there was a period of time where AIPAC was opposed to the Israeli government. So that was an unusual situation because AIPAC had been in lockstep with the Israeli government, and that had been part of its ideology. But when the Israeli government did this real turn and started thinking about the reality of a two-state solution, it kind of took AIPAC by surprise, and it took them a while to adjust to that. But they came around eventually, and they kind of came back to, okay, what we're going to do is support the Israeli government, whatever that government says. So that is where we are as a movement, and we do not have, well, I don't know that we do as a movement make statements. Rarely. Those statements tend to be, and not everybody in the movement is happy when the movement makes statements. On both ends of the spectrum, there is pushback against the statements. And the statements tend to be statements that embody the well-being of Israeli Jews and of Palestinians, that take those both into account, and are pro-two-state, and pro-human rights for all human beings. And but it's complicated. And I actually there's something called the Joint Israel Commission that's made up of rabbis and lay leaders in the movement that tries to come up with programming and information that will be useful to the movement as a whole. And it's really difficult because even in this commission, there's so much disagreement over what kinds of programming, what kinds of information. So I'm going to stop here. We could take just a couple of minutes if people have questions, and then I know I said in my last email, that we would go until 9, but I'm gonna try, if we can close before 9, I'm gonna try to do that, because it turns out I have another obligation that I forgot about. So anyway, so that is. But tell me if you have questions on any of this. I know we've covered a huge amount of territory. It's a lot of stuff that we've addressed.
So there's a splinter group of Reconstructionists, about 10 Reconstructionist communities, and it's called Reconstructionists Expanding Our Conversation About Israel-Palestine. And they put on a bunch of really great programming about, but it's much, much more, I mean, the problem is, right, you don't want to be in a situation where being empathetic to people who are being bombed into, you want to have the, those things shouldn't be they shouldn't be opposites, supporting, so.
So I just want to say, I don't think we should, in this context, get into the kind of our personal orientations around this issue. But I appreciate Lila pointing that out. There is another splinter group to the right of the movement, and it is the splinter group that was the core of the Kaplan Center. And those rabbis and those congregations felt that the center of gravity of the movement was too liberal or too progressive. And so we have those two splinter groups, and then we have the group that was splintered from, that's in the middle of those two splinter groups. And so far, all three groups have been able to remain under the umbrella of the Reconstructionist movement. But stay tuned. It's a very tough time, right? It's a very tough time. It's been a tough time since October 7th, especially in the aftermath of October 7th. It's been a very tough time, and it continues to be. So, thank you for that, Lila. One or two more questions, and don't have to. If there are no questions, that's okay. Or you can, send me questions. Or if we had a lot of really juicy questions, I could imagine we could schedule a follow-up where all we did was answer people's questions, if there were enough of those. So
I do have a question. Did Kaplan ever write anything about the Palestinians or acknowledge?
That is a great question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head. One thing I didn't say, Kaplan was an incredible diary keeper. He wrote for decades and decades. He kept a diary. And there's a scholar of his life named Mel Skult, who's been publishing his voluminous diaries, and he's only like 50, I don't even think he's 50% of the way through. There are now 3 volumes of Kaplan's diaries, and sometimes it's the case that if you can't find something in his kind of formal published writings, you can find his, you can find him making references to those things in the diaries. And Mel Sculpt, he himself is now, I think, close to 90, if not in his 90s, and he's still working. This has been a lifelong project for him as a scholar of publishing Kaplan's diaries, and he's usually a good resource. And if you look at any of the volumes, the 3 volumes that exist so far, there's a really great index, a topic index. So I think that would be. I don't know the answer, Lila, and I could certainly pose that on my rabbinical listserv and see, if people have any knowledge of it. I think that would be interesting to see. Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys for sticking this out, and for I felt like we had our mouth to the fire hose here this evening, but I hope it was okay, and really appreciate it.
Thanks to you.
Thank you, Steve. It was
It was my pleasure, and so I'll look forward. Maybe there'll be some kind of a follow-up. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much.
All right. And we recorded this, so Lila, it'll be available on the cloud, right?
Right. So Tony wanted to see it?
Yeah.
Okay, we can upload it, or we could just share the link.
Whatever you think is best.
Okay, all right.
This is I do not know what the.
Okay, I'll email it you guys, Emily. And all right. So
Okay.
this was great. You did a great job. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, guys. All right. I'll see you soon.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you, Lara.
Bye. Bye.